NCC 8472 asks, would it be possible to construct a typical Age of Sail ship of the line but replace the various guns with World War II versions? What kind of modifications would be needed to be made either to the ship or to the guns? And how would such a ship perform in combat against its contemporaries? Well, assuming some kind of time-travelling shenanigans are involved, at least in terms of supplying the guns, it's not actually that difficult, believe it or not. I had to have a little bit of a look around because, surprisingly enough, the kind of databases that contain information about weights, recoil, shell weight, propellant charges, etc., for guns from the early 20th century and those that contain the information for things like ships' cannon from the early 19th century tend to be very different resources. But anyway, it's actually fairly possible. I mean, the average 4-inch gun weighs about the same as one of the lighter weight 32-pounders. Some of the shorter barrel 4.5 and 4.7-inch guns are about the same kind of mass as the average 32-pounder gun, but they're a little bit harder to find because by the time you get to World War II and you've got the longer barrel 4.5s, then they've gone above, so you can't really use those. But generally speaking, you could use a 4 or 4.5-inch gun of one of the shorter types, or even an American 5-inch 25 caliber gun if you really wanted to, and you could replace the 32-pounders on a one-for-one basis. When it comes to things like 24-pounders, 18-pounders and 12-pounders, you want to look at varying marks of 3-inch gun, to be perfectly honest. Sort of some of the longer barrel, more modern versions can be used to replace 18 and 12-pounders, and then maybe some of the shorter barrel versions to replace 12s. Now, for the ships themselves, to be honest, the main thing you probably want to need to do in terms of modification is actually expand the magazines, because unlike inert iron cannonballs, obviously if you're stocking your entire ammunition supply in terms of shells on the open gun decks of a Age of Sail ship of the line, that's probably not going to end well for you long term. So yeah, more powder monkeys effectively, because they're going to have to carry both charges and shells up. Or to be honest, when you talk about 3 and 4-inch guns, they're probably coming as a single unit. So yeah, more magazine space would basically be the thing. Modifications to the gun. Now this is probably where the most modification is needed, because most gun mounts for those kind of weapons are designed to be serviced by men standing up, and the gun is kind of at that, roughly that kind of level. Age of Sail ship of the line, the gun is significantly lower down than the average standing man, so the existing mounts wouldn't be able to be used except on maybe on the quarterdeck or the main deck, where obviously it's open. So for the regular gun, but fortunately for the regular gun mounts, you can probably, given that you aren't going to need so much the elevation and rotational mechanisms of the average gun mount, you can probably just dismount the gun itself and put it pretty much in the same kind of wooden gun carriage that the existing cannon were in at that point, because although the charge weights are slightly lower, obviously the explosive is slightly greater, but overall in terms of recoil, etc., there's not a tremendous amount of additional total energy and acceleration of the gun as compared to something like a 32-pounder cannon with a very large, sort of significantly larger charge of gunpowder. And obviously there are certain recoil mechanisms built into more modern guns which you might want to keep. The other thing is, of course, that these are breech-loading guns, so you don't need to have them run into the ship completely, although obviously you probably would want to have the slack on the rope to allow you to run them in for storage whilst you're not in action. But in terms of performance against its contemporaries, well, it's pretty much a no-brainer, isn't it? Use high explosive, high explosive shells were one of the contributing factors to the end of wooden ships of the line anyway. And even though you can't turn or elevate it all that much, you now have a broadside that's firing shells a heck of a lot faster, a heck of a lot longer range, a heck of a lot more accurately, and also a lot faster. Bear in mind, like Nelson's gunners and such were considered really good because they could get a shot off every 30 seconds. With these kind of sort of breech-loading weapons, even in their gun carriages, it'll be a case of a decent crew could probably reload and get a shot off every few seconds if they're solidly fixed, but that's probably going to wear the ship out quite quickly. If you've got the slack in the rope, kind of like an actual period naval cannon, most of your time is probably going to be spent running the gun back out again, at which point you're probably talking salvo every 5 to 10 seconds, depending on how energetic the crew is feeling. So, yeah, that kind of ship would be an absolute monster. I mean, a ship of the line at Trafalgar that's armed with a lower gun deck of 4 to 4.5-inch guns and a middle and upper gun decks of 3-inch weapons, all firing high explosives, firing effectively a full broadside, let's say every 10 seconds because the captain's feeling kind. That's 6 broadsides of ship-shattering power for the period within the time that it's going to take anyone else to let off a single broadside of regular solid shot. So, yeah, it'll be a complete outside context problem. Jack Ace asks, which captain holds the record for the longest and shortest command? That is going to depend, I think, on how you define command. I mean, obviously the most obvious way of defining it would be to say, well, it's the amount of time a captain spends in charge of an individual ship, which I suppose is one way of looking at it. However, that's not strictly the way it's used in some naval terminology, because a command can be held to be from the time you take command of the ship and take it out to sea to the time you return to port and the crew all disembarks. Now, that form of command, of the use of the definition of the word command, has more relevance back in sort of the days of the Age of Sail and moving forward into the 19th century, when ships would be gone for months, potentially years at a time, and then when the crew came back, they would be discharged. They would, of course, then be free to re-enlist, but that command was over, even though the captain may stay assigned to that ship and may take it back out again on another voyage. So to determine who holds the longest period of command is going to be very difficult in that regard. And also then you've got to think about, does this include, is this just for ships, for captains of ships, or does this include admirals of fleets? Because obviously some admirals stayed in command of certain fleets for years or decades at a time, which would technically qualify. I mean, if you boiling it down to the most basic one, which is the sort of captain in charge of a ship from the time it leaves port on a voyage to the time it returns and the crew is discharged, you're probably looking at somebody in the Age of Sail. I mean, Francis Drake, with his circumnavigation of the world in charge of the Golden Hind, is probably a good contender. That was around about 4 years consistently at sea, which is pushing the limits of what a wooden ship is really capable of. So you could go for that. I mean, and as I say, there's probably quite a number of other major voyages of exploration that occurred that lasted 3 to 4 years, possibly more. Feel free to comment in the description. So yeah, for the longest, I'm afraid you're going to have to give a little bit more clarification on what exactly you mean. Shortest command, though, is probably pretty easy. I think there's going to be very few rivals to whichever poor soul was put in charge of the Vassar. Total of 1.3 kilometres travelled on its first voyage, and yeah, that came to a rather spectacular end. So that's probably a matter of an official command that lasted maybe a few hours, maybe even less than that. I mean, Sir George Carew in charge of the Mary Rose is probably not too far off, but the Mary Rose, from the time it left Portsmouth to the time it sank, was actually in command for at least a few days. Lewis Maskell asks, your top 5 naval songs, hymns, shanties, ditties, tunes, etc. Well, as far as that goes, top 5, I'd have to say, well, I'm very partial to Hearts of Oak. I actually prefer that over Rule Britannia. So Hearts of Oak would be, and this is in no particular order, Hearts of Oak. Shores of Tripoli is also quite the nice, rousing rendition. I'd also have to say the German Marinemarsch Panzerschiff, I think that's what it's called. That always seems to put a weird, jaunty step in my day for some reason. I don't know what it is about German naval music, but it seems a lot more uplifting and upbeat and happy than the vast majority of German-based music, but there you go. Of course, there's the good old schoolyard one, What Should We Do with a Drunken Sailor? Again, nice, puts a nice grin on your face. And lastly, well, cannot actually repeat it on this channel, otherwise I will probably get demonetized for foul and abusive language, but there you go. But if anybody's interested, there was a rather interesting song that the sailors of HMS Penelope made up when they were getting thoroughly fed up of being bombed by German and Italian aircraft in the Mediterranean in World War II. So yes, it was described by the person who composed it aboard ship as a shooting song designed to motivate the gunners aboard the anti-aircraft guns. And yeah, if anyone knows exactly what the lyrics are to that, well, obviously I do, but feel free to post it in the comments below. Emerald Leaf Eon asks, have you been to the US and seen any of the ships that have been saved? If so, which ships have you seen? If you haven't, what ships would you like to see? Let's say top 5 in the US. So yes, I have been to the US, once in March 2001 and again in August 2003. And boy, were those very different visits. But anyway, so yeah, that was mid-teens Drac, and I was being taken by a family. So somewhat unsurprisingly, we spent most of our time in Disney World, Universal Studios, and the NASA Kennedy Space Center. I rather enjoyed the Space Center myself. And a bit of time in New York and the surrounding area. So I have seen the USS Intrepid. I've even got some photos somewhere, but being that this was 2001, there's still 35mm film, not digital, so there you go. So I've seen those, that ship, haven't seen any of the others, but in terms of what I would like to see, well, obviously I will be heading to the US next year, all things going well, hopefully, as per whichever, was it last Drydock? Yeah, last Drydock, I think. So top 5 that I'd like to see. I mean, this isn't necessarily top 5 that I will see, but there you go. Due to, well, geographic reasons. Why do you have such a big country, honestly? Why can't you just drive everywhere in a day like you can here? Anyway, that aside. Yeah, top 5. USS Olympia, definitely want to see that. I would like to see USS Texas, but I'm probably not going to be able to. I'd like to see an Iowa class. Well, apart from anything, just to see what all the fuss is about, and also I haven't physically seen a battleship before, and certainly not a dreadnought type one. Outside of that, I'd like to see. I believe there's a World War II spec Fletcher floating around somewhere in the US. So I'd really like to see that, and of course the USS Constitution, because you can never get enough old Age of Sail ships. Striker 1959 asks, do you think Gneisenau could have done anything worthwhile if its conversion to 15-inch guns was completed? So much as I obviously do think that the 15-inch refit to the Scharnhorst class was definitely a thing that should have happened, at the same time, by the time Gneisenau actually went in to get that done, it was a little bit late on in the war. If it had been fitted, assuming it had been actually been completed in time, it would have been coming back into service quite late in the war. At which point, its opportunity to actually do anything of any significant import probably quite badly reduced. If it had been done relatively quickly, potentially it could have sailed with maybe Scharnhorst for North Cape, or with Tirpitz during one of their various attempts, or maybe it would have gone out with Lutzow and Admiral Hipper during Barents Sea. Oh no, it wouldn't. That was too early. That was far too early. Sorry, my brain's getting carried away with me there. So yeah, it could have done something in the Norwegian campaign, forced the Allies to deploy more heavy ships to the area, but realistically, yeah, that's it. It basically would be like a smaller Tirpitz, and probably would have been either X-crafted or bombed out of existence fairly quickly. So I think the time for the 15-inch gun armed Scharnhorst to really have a major effect on the war would have been in the first 2, maybe 3 years of the war, 39, 40, 41, maybe into 42. So unfortunately, I think the refit, as if it would have been completed instead of the poor thing getting bombed almost out of existence, probably just a bit too late for it to do anything really worthwhile. Brad asks, going along with the recent questions about submarines, tech transfers, trade interdiction, etc., if you were given the opportunity to take over one age of sail conflict anywhere, which would you choose, where different strategic choices would change the world and get mentioned as the naval equivalent of Alexander? I.e., you read a historical account and go, I know I could have done a better job than that lot. Now, by specifying age of sail, you made it a little bit difficult because my default answer to this kind of thing, sort of ancient naval battles, was actually be the Punic Wars. Not specifically because I have any particular great experience in managing mass fleets of galleys, but or triremes or whatever you want to call them, but more to do with the fact that, well, with the copy of a history book, I know where all the weather and the storms were, so I can tell the Carthaginian fleet to avoid them, and create a much more interesting dynamic in the Mediterranean than just Romans everywhere. I mean, it might be easy to say the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and obviously with a copy of historical naval documents and histories, it would be somewhat easy to win. I mean, fair enough, you're still going up against the likes of Tromp and von Reuter, so it's not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination, but a little bit more imagination and a little bit of foreknowledge would help greatly. But I don't. If the second part of the question, to go down in history as like some great naval commander, well, to be honest, I don't think that would happen particularly because with the English advantages in heavy ships at the time, they should have done a lot better than they did. So that would probably just go down as a case of, oh, well, look, the person with massive heavy ships versus lightweight ships managed to win. Shock, horror. I think if there's anywhere that you could potentially use for these purposes, I think off the top of my head, I think probably the best one would be the Anglo-Spanish naval war that developed in the aftermath of the Armada. Um, because things like the dates, times, and sailings of the various Spanish treasure fleets are all known and recorded. The locations of some of the major Spanish naval movements are recorded, and of course, some of the errors in tactics and the bad people to put in command that kind of led to that whole thing fizzling out with several embarrassing English losses would also already be known. So I'd be able to turn that around, at least in theory, assuming anyone listened to me, at which point that would probably actually garner a fair bit of fame because, I mean, it's one. Spain is the predominant naval power at the time, and it's one thing for the English to see off the Spanish Armada just about in their own home waters. It's quite another thing to take that same sort of vaguely ragtag English force and then go and beat the Spanish on their own home turf and somehow have magical divine knowledge of exactly where all those lovely, wonderful Spanish treasure ships full of gold and silver are coming. Although it would have to be striking a very careful balance between getting enough of them to keep the English war effort going and not basically pulling off exactly what the Spanish managed to do, which is to put their economy in free fall through saturating the market in terms of precious metals and other such valuable items. Moongara asks, how much does naval artillery development parallel land artillery development? Is there a particular order that things need to be available when building a ship? And what is cemented armour? So, how much does naval artillery development parallel land? It diverges relatively quickly because although in the periods of maybe 1500s, 1600s ish, they're virtually interchangeable. By the time you start getting up to the production of larger numbers of naval guns and ships of the line and line-head tactics, broadside ships, etc., the simple fact of the matter is that if you've got a gun on land, you have to move that thing, and until the advent of motorized transportation and such, you have to move that thing by hand or with animals, which generally means you have lighter weight weapons, and for a weapon of a given caliber or shot weight, they also tend to be lighter than their naval equivalents because, again, it's difficult to move, and you need them as light as possible, with the sole exception of some of the bigger siege guns. And also, the simple fact of the matter is, when generally in land battles, you're shooting at men and horses, which are a lot squishier and easier to kill than ships of the line. So, compared to that, to the cannons on the ship of the line, a 9 pounder or a 12 pounder is considered effectively a pop gun on a ship of the line, and probably not even worth having except for maybe chase guns and the odd thing like that. You're talking 12s, 24s, 32s, maybe a few 18s scattered around, etc. So that, but you look on land, it's like the number of 24 or 32 pounder field guns that you might find in the average army of the 1800s into the early 1900s is very, very low compared to the several dozen you might have on a ship of the line. And this thing kind of carries forward in that because naval ship guns, they need to be bigger and nastier and more durable because you're going to need to rely on them an awful lot more. And the fact being relatively fixed in place, you don't need to move them that much. You can afford them to also be heavier. It means that generally naval artillery development kind of parallels land gun development in terms of manufacturing techniques and everything, but in terms of the actual guns themselves, they're usually way, way bigger. Way bigger, much more heavily built, and generally also have a considerably longer range because the sea, generally being flat, affords you the ability to shoot long distances. The land usually doesn't, unless you're using something like a howitzer. And because of the way that force is transferred, howitzers are not generally the best things to use in ships anyway, plus their long flight time means it's very difficult to hit a moving target with them. You can kind of see a good snapshot of this in, say, the Boer War, when one of the Royal Navy's big armoured cruisers shows up, and despite being the British Empire, the British troops in South Africa are somewhat imperiled by the Boers and their use of slightly more advanced Krupp field artillery, thanks to the Germans, at which point the cruiser dismounts a bunch of its guns and sends them over on shore with naval parties, and suddenly having very big, heavy naval guns with an awful lot of firepower is one of the major tipping factors in a couple of battles. But whilst on land, that is quite the considerable artillery park that you've suddenly brought to a gunfight. In terms of the ship itself, the ship basically hasn't sacrificed any of its main guns. The armoured cruiser was landing stuff that would be considered secondary or tertiary weaponry on a cruiser, let alone a battleship. But this was kind of pretty much about as big as you're going to be able to realistically manoeuvre on land. In terms of things needing to be available in a particular order when building a ship, well, we have mentioned a number of times before the really long lead items like guns and machinery. Machinery obviously is necessary at a very critical stage of the ship's construction because it's very difficult to install all your engines and machinery once you've built the ship's hull up past a certain point and you can't physically get into the deep parts of the ship with large items anymore. The guns, as we've said before, are the longest lead items because they take an incredibly long time to manufacture, but they don't need to be available quite as soon as the machinery because, well, generally speaking, as you can see here with the USS Florida, the guns go on the top, so you've got a fair bit of time before you need to actually fit them, but you do need to order them ahead of time. So guns and machinery usually the two biggest ticket items that you need to order before the hull itself. Armour is also actually, surprisingly, once you get into the realm of dreadnoughts, needs to be ordered a fair bit in advance because it takes a fair bit of time to manufacture that amount of armour, and to the correct quality, have it tested, etc., etc. And this is why it's important to lock your ship designs in fairly soon, because the armour can be shaped to and is shaped to a certain degree to the hull. So if all of a sudden someone changes the hull dimensions, that's a lot of armour that's gone to waste, and it's very valuable. Hence why armour plate on ships that were converted to other uses tended to be kept around in the hopes that it could be reused on something else rather than throw away the investment. So yeah, generally it was, does this item take an awfully long time to manufacture, or is it really big and needs to go into the ship before other parts of the ship are built around and over it? Those would be the things that you needed first. So you'd first order your guns, then you'd order your machinery, then you'd actually start collecting materials for the ship's hull, building the hull, etc. That's kind of the brief summary. I mean, there's so many parts to a warship that it's a very deep and complicated field. So, for the final part of that question, what is cemented armour? So, at its very basic, and please forgive me if I wander off onto some kind of technical tangent. I am an engineer, and this kind of stuff was kind of actually one of my favourite aspects of my engineering course. But anyway, um, cementing armour at its very most basic is taking a lump of steel in a sheet or a plate. You then heat it up, and you, through some method, induce carbon to collect within the face of the steel on one side. In Harvey armour, this was done by literally stacking burning coals on top of one side of the plate and keeping them burning for ages. Later on, in Krupp armour, other methods were used, carbon-rich gases and such, to accelerate the process and get a more even spread. This obviously turns your basic kind of steel into a high carbon steel on one side, and then once you've made that face high carbon steel, you then have to quench it relatively quickly. And the idea of this is that it creates one side of the steel which has a very, very hard carbon steel face, which is very good at resisting shell fire, but is of course brittle. And the back of the plate is very tough and flexible because has nowhere near the same level of carbon content. Now, to get it back into a usable shape, depending on the process you've used, there are a lot further steps to it. However, that in its very, very basic form is how you make cemented plate armour, and why it is superior to regular steel, because you have all the resistive benefits of a really, 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 really hard, in terms of mechanical engineering terms, a very hard face, and if that is breached or the armour is hit by a lot of force, then the tough back holds it together and also prevents the overall spread of shockwaves, so it adds an additional toughness and an additional ability to resist incoming shells. So it affects the material properties of the steel quite immensely. You can see obviously in the picture, this is an illustration of a cut through, and you can see that the difference in the crystalline structure of the steel is visible even to the naked eye when it's been cut in half. So yes, I managed to avoid a technical derail. Huzzah! Zarkon de Grissom asks, if ships of the line had a grain-like food, how did they keep the bread-like stuff from spoiling? Was it copious amounts of salt or some form of grain that didn't spoil as fast, if at all? So there are two ways of doing it. One is simply by keeping stuff in flour form, or even grain form in some earlier ships, because stuff like grain and flour is fairly low moisture content and can be kept that way by basic sealing techniques to a large degree. And then you would make the stuff fresh, whereas obviously once you have baked goods like bread, they do have much higher moisture content, which means in a sea environment, certainly in early ships, they will spoil very quickly. So yeah, effectively, to keep the bread-like stuff from spoiling, the answer was don't make it until you actually want to eat it, and make it in quantities that the men can eat fairly quickly. The other way of doing it was to basically bake it into something that was so hard and moisture free that it was more building material or melee weapon than food stuff. And this is where things like hardtack come in. Yes, in theory you could eat it, and despite their best efforts, there were other things like weevils that would quite happily tuck into it. But whilst a weevil might just be a little bit of wiggly extra protein, the low moisture content made it very unlikely that it was going to go mouldy or spoil. And obviously, yes, salt everywhere as much as humanly possible, as long as it was still vaguely edible. Mem Mori asks, how did shipboard generators evolve from when they were commonly used on warships until the end of World War II? How did the concurrent measures to keep the ship powered under fire evolve? So electrical generators aboard ships generally followed similar patterns of development to electrical generation on land, with the sole proviso that obviously on board a ship where there's a lot of water and dampness, insulation is somewhat more important. So they really needed to be able to develop insulation a lot further and to be perfectly honest, make generators a lot more compact before they could be taken to sea, as compared to what they could, where electricity could be used on land for things like wireless communications and such. So at first, shipboard generators were relatively small because of these issues. They would tend to be used for things like electrical lighting, some small items of sort of motors and such like, and also for things like telegraphy and later radio transmissions. As the technology advanced, and motors became more insulated, and there was a lot less risk of shorting out, then power demand started to go up, so the number and size of generators started to increase. One of the leading innovators in this field was actually the French Navy. They got electrically powered training for their turrets working a heck of a lot sooner than practically anybody else. I mean, in French pre-dreadnoughts, as we covered in the French pre-dreadnought video, some of them had electrically powered gun turrets, whereas the British were not on that level, and they tried much later with the Invincible class battle cruisers, well, with one of them, with HMS Invincible, and discovered they hadn't quite got the technology right, and they kind of just put on a minor electrical storm every time they tried to turn the turrets with massive arcs of blue fire, which looks pretty but is not particularly effective. Unless you've been boarded in the turret, I guess, maybe? And of course, there are always choices to be made in that term, but those terms as to whether you're going to have your turrets electrically powered, guns electrically elevated or not. But as things went on, you obviously had things like refrigeration, even more lights, loading systems for shells and such could be electrically powered if you wanted them to be. Engine controls, communications equipment, all this kind of stuff, and then obviously later on radar and fire control equipment could all be electrically powered as well. So this influenced again the size and number of generators would go up and up and up, and the wiring on the ship would get more and more complicated. As for how measures kept the ship powered whilst under fire evolved, well, this is why for a long period of time electricity remained very much a subsidiary, nice-to-have thing for stuff like telegraphy and lighting, because the shock of heavy guns firing would either trip out circuit breakers, or you'd just get shock-induced shorts and dips and surges in the electrical cables, none of which was particularly good. So again, it was a matter of stabilizing, earthing, if such a thing can technically be said when you're at sea, and better insulating the cabling. And as that technology advanced, then so too did everything else. Of course, they still didn't quite get it right, even by World War II standards. Obviously, we had ships knocking out their own radar with the shock of firing their guns, and of course, if you got the wiring slightly wrong, as per USS South Dakota, things could go pretty badly when you suddenly needed a massive increase in the amount of power that you were drawing off of your generators. And the generators themselves, obviously, they could be powered by the main engines, by the main power plant, or they could be powered by their own subsidiary power plants, usually later on diesel. So yeah, a little bit of a brief overview, but hopefully that gives you some idea. Please feel free to clarify if you would like a more detailed response. And finally, Terminus Est asks, two-parter. One, just how serious was the inter-service rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army? And two, opinion on the book Japanese Destroyer Captain, as I found it an interesting read, but there's some very questionable points, in particular how much he blames Imperial Japanese Navy Command for the loss, and massively downplays Japanese imperialism. What is your opinion if you've read it? So, with regards to the inter-service rivalry between the Japanese Navy and Japanese Army, I believe that was mostly covered in the last Drydock, and I think in some of the answers to questions in this Drydock, so I'm just going to leave it there with quite bad, to the point that, as we said before, they had completely separate lines of development for things that they really should have cooperated on, and even cases of mutual refusal of support, which resulted in losses to the Japanese war machine that they could ill afford, and could have been prevented simply because they just would not cooperate with each other in terms of things like fighters not giving cover for either ships if they were army fighters, or support to men if on the ground if they were navy aircraft, unless they'd been specifically ordered to, and the list goes on from there. It's a very, very bizarre situation. Now, as regards the book Japanese Destroyer Captain, I haven't read the book itself, but the stuff that you mention doesn't necessarily surprise me. In terms of massively downplaying Japanese imperialism, well, much as I hate to even touch politics with a 10-foot pole, this isn't exactly a new thing, so I can kind of cover it within the scope of this period. Certain elements of Japanese society have never quite accepted the fact that they lost, or that really Japan did much, if anything, bad. I mean, that's still happening today, despite the historical evidence. So the fact that a given author might choose to downplay the worst of Japanese imperialism isn't going to be particularly surprising to me, albeit that obviously it does make reflections on certain motivations for what they or their orders told them to do somewhat suspect. And in terms of blaming Imperial Japanese Navy Command for the loss, well, again, in World War II literature, both Japanese, literature covering World War II from people, both Japanese and German, and I don't know actually so much about Italian, so I wouldn't necessarily say that, but without working from a base of knowledge, but certainly Japanese and German literature, there is a tendency amongst sort of the lower ranking, and even some of the higher ranking officers, to blame their superiors for the problem. It's not quite the whole betrayed army myth that built up around Imperial Germany and the end of World War One, but in some cases it's close to it, and this is why you get these sort of memes about, oh well, this commander, that commander was incompetent, this leader, that leader was incompetent. In some cases you can definitely point to mistakes and the fact that they did make fairly big ones, but at the same time, if you believe at face value what some of these sort of generals and below say about German high command, Japanese high command, etc., you believe that if it hadn't been for the people at the top, then the lower ranking officers would have carried the day, and Germany would have swept a glorious victory, and Japan would have established the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and all of that. And, well, once you realise the logical extension of what they're saying, it becomes a little bit absurd. Let's say it's not to say that strategic mistakes weren't made; they definitely were, but for the most part, unless you're something like, say, early World War II Italian naval commanders or similar, for the most part, to get to high command, you generally have to have some modicum of competence. So their ability to command and to lead and to make strategic decisions isn't going to be wholly and completely off the ball. Because let's face it, apart from anything else, in some ways, that assuming that kind of stuff actually does a great disservice to the men who died fighting them on the Allied side, because ultimately, if German and Japanese high command were so blindingly incompetent, why the heck did we spend 6 years at war with them? It's the same thing sometimes. I mean, I know, obviously, as an Englishman, I'm almost genetically duty-bound to rag on the French on occasion, but there is a limit to what's acceptable even with that. Again, one, for historical accuracy reasons, the French were by no means easy pushovers most of the time. But two, again, it's like, if the French are such sort of cheese-eating surrender monkeys as was going around at the beginning of the 2000s, explain World War One. Explain why there was the 100 Years' War. Explain the Napoleonic Wars. Explain all these really long, really hard-fought wars with the French. You don't fight wars of that scale, length, and duration and ferocity unless your opponent, or in the case of World War One, the person you're fighting alongside against somebody else, is actually relatively good at their job. You might be better. That doesn't mean they're bad. And the same thing with this. the Japanese armed forces and the German armed forces were not led by mewling idiots, and it's very important to remember that, not just from a historical accuracy side, but also from, as I say, simply from the fact that an awful lot of people gave their lives to sort out that situation. And to suggest that they were so stupid that they spent years and years and years throwing away their lives against a bunch of morons is actually, that's pretty reprehensible in my view. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily take those points on board. Sorry for the slight rant, but it is what it is. Feel free to comment, agree or disagree in the comments below. Apart from anything, I can't actually stop you, so whatever. And that brings to an end 2 hours and 40 minutes of Patreon Drydock Q&A. There's got to be an easier way to do this. Suggestions in the comments below if you've got an idea to allow me to continue this, because obviously it is a Patreon benefit, but allow me to continue this in a way that doesn't require me to spend basically an entire week recording stuff and researching just for the Drydock, because yeah, I've got other stuff, other videos that I need to do as well. Anyway, that aside, well, I suppose, yeah, it's can't complain that much, can I? Because I mean, if there's that many questions around, then there's a fair number of supporters on Patreon, and they're interested enough to exercise their question asking rights, which is all good and very much appreciated. So yes, I'm not asking you to stop asking questions. I'm not asking you to reduce the number of questions. I'm just asking for some suggestions as to how maybe I can facilitate answering your questions in a slightly more even and balanced way than, oh god, it's that time of the month. Anyway. That said, thank you very much for listening. To coin a phrase from one of my other favourite YouTubers, if indeed you still are, and props to you if you are, I hope I haven't scared you off with this massive amount of Drydock this week, and I'll see you again in another video, hopefully. Thank you very much.